So thank you everybody for joining us today in the Overcoming Discrimination workshop. Um, Ephraim from Openhouse and I will be presenting to you today. And so I'm going to turn it over to Ephraim Getahun for his presentation. Ephraim?
Sure. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Ephraim Getahun. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the son of Wasihun Getahun of Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and my mother is Wugayo Makonnen Katama of Harar, Ethiopia. Overcoming discrimination, this theme, it sounds really nice and it sounds victorious and it sounds finished. And to have overcome discrimination, like when I hear this phrase, I think of the black and brown bodies marching alongside Martin Luther King as hymns of "We shall overcome, take over." What does it mean when I'm thinking about overcoming discrimination? For as often as I have read these words, I'm torn if it's something to celebrate because it places the onus on the one being oppressed. It's accolades for somehow surviving a system designed to keep you from surviving. So when we look at some of the most marginalized communities navigating our society, we so often celebrate the resilience and the tenacity it costs to survive its weight. And I think about, like how does a black trans woman overcome discrimination, or how do undocumented immigrants and asylee seekers overcome discrimination? How do poor people, without access to so much that people, even in this virtual realm that we're sharing now, the access that we have to resources, how did they overcome discrimination? So I want to be very careful because I don't want to invalidate those who have survived the very system that desires to choke them. I think, of course, we should uplift people that have gone through this long and incessant fight to stand tall in spite of the discrimination they face. But the goal, when I think about overcoming discrimination, is eradicating the system that forced them to have to become resilient in the first place. I want to think about a world where people don't have to even fight, and what this concept of overcoming discrimination is something in the past. This almost equitable utopia that is not necessarily ever attainable. It's just the constant reach for always trying to get to that level. So we live in a precarious time. I mean, it's a ridiculous point in history that we're in, to the point that we have to meet in this virtual realm like this on Zoom. And to many, it seems that discrimination in the forms of like racism or gender oppression are rearing their ugly heads for the first time. But the fact is that these dark spots have always kind of been closely in marriage to the history of this nation. So in reality, like the current political climate in relation to the pandemic have exacerbated divides that already existed. And it's further pushed extremes into the margins. So discrimination is so often not the extreme action, the actions of racism and sexism like our imagination can imagine. I mean, true evil, like when you think about, racist acts, someone saying the N-word while walking across the street, or not too long ago at Lake Merritt, they had nooses hanging from these trees. Those kinds of acts of racism are horrifying, but those aren't the ones that I'm really concerned about. The truest evil of discrimination is its nuance. It's a very seductive approach. It's almost impossible to name it because the shadow work that it kind of lives in, and the types of discrimination that makes it impossible to call out. And it's the kind of discrimination that would silence women and invalidate them, or that overlooks black applicants for jobs and ideas and denies trans communities access, while touting progressive work. So it's that insidious nature of discrimination that's so hard to kind of like grab onto that changes our lives in a more direct way. So even when it looks at me boldly in the face, with its chest out and its nostrils flared, the one who acts on the oppression can deny its existence. So that's what makes it so difficult to name. I'm talking about also the kinds of discrimination that informs, people to cross the street when they see someone like me coming, or lock their door, or clutch their purses. When you see young black men coming your way, obviously we know that no one in this room is causing, significant violent actions towards these groups, but we share, all of us, and myself included, a lot of prejudices that also inform the egregious acts of violence that happen to marginalized groups all of the time. So if those same prejudices and biases exist in other people that inform those acts of violence, that means it exists within ourselves, in every single one of us. I mean, anti-Blackness sits in myself. Anti-transness sits in me. Misogyny sits in me. It's just by virtue of the social contract that we take part in every day, that informs those things inside of us. So if it sits in me, I'd be very hard pressed to not expect that it also sits in everyone here. So so often when discussing discrimination work and overcoming discrimination, I think about violence, because truly discrimination is a violent weapon against Black, trans, queer people, gay, lesbian included. This violence is nothing new. It has shown its face against queer bodies and Black bodies and women's bodies over and over and over again in our history. And so this violence is like an innate part of our psyche and that collective history that we share. And it's designed to show itself in all parts of the social contract we agree on. So I have to ask everyone that's present, what are we going to do about this? If it's innately within ourselves, if it's something that I share, if anti-Blackness is in me and if anti-Blackness is in all of us, what are we going to do about that to overcome that discrimination? What are we going to do to stop violence in all forms, or people who experience discrimination? What does a world where people don't have to overcome discrimination even look like? And at Openhouse, at the LGBT Senior Center, with whom I'm here to represent, there's a Black trans woman I have grown to work really closely with in our programming, and she's headstrong, she's extremely opinionated. She'll tell you, her phrase is, I'm an unapologetic Black trans woman. She'll say it with like all of the earth within her, and she'll say it with such pride and strength. And it fills me up to see her, obviously, be able to stand in her truth in that way. But when she talks about her story and how she's gotten to where she is, I hear so much heartbreak in it. How does someone learn to thrive in spite of everything working against her? Having grown up in a time where trans women were arrested for wearing their clothes because it affirmed their gender, not being able to work, being seen as pariah in this society. How much is there to celebrate when the person I see who's so resilient and so powerful was subjected to such severe oppression? And imagine if this woman wasn't subjected to these hurdles and was afforded the freedoms that we all seem to enjoy regularly, where would she be today? What kind of woman would she have become? And that's not to invalidate the resilience that she is. So back to the question, how do we overcome discrimination? How do we overcome bias? We have to look within ourselves, because if we believe we can stop the violence that forces Black trans women to be resilient and fight for their literal lives, then we have to look within ourselves to fight head on the biases we hold. So we have to kind of imagine a world where we embrace Black, trans, brown, gay, lesbian men in the same way and we embrace those we love. And it's that kind of like radical thinking. It's almost like a spiritual it's transcendent place to have to look at the person, their entire personhood. Sorry, I kind of lost my place. To see the whole person, their personhood. So how much better would our lives be? Would this city be? Would this world be if we just approached every engagement with another person as if we engaged with those that we care about deeply, those that are easy to associate with? So earlier I asked, what are we going to do? What are the direct actions that each of us can take? And there's some little simple roadmap that I've kind of outlined. And it's first tackling the denial, right? If we can't arrive at the same understanding that we all implicitly bias, that we all have that within ourselves, then the work already stops here. We can show up for trainings and equity conversations, but if that denial is at the forefront of your minds, then we're not even going to get anywhere. So too many times when we are, if we can't arrive at that understanding, then that we're all implicitly biased, the work already stops. So too many times when we're discussing discrimination or going through racial equity work, the assumption is, so happy that you're here, love it, love the conversation, love what we're talking about, but I'm not biased. I don't have that within myself to other someone else. But if the biases, and I'm telling you, these biases exist within myself, then I'm telling you that they will most likely exist within you as well. So I'm a nurse. I've worked in long-term care for over a decade. I was a CNA for 6 years, a nurse for another 6 years. And after a couple of years, I was able to prove my competence and became, from the night shift nurse, was the charge nurse and the supervisor, then became the memory care director at the long-term care facility that I was working at. And working in administration for the first time in long-term care, I became very aware of my queerness, both intersecting also with my Blackness. So when I'm sitting at IDT meetings and with other administrators, I immediately start to self-fulfill the otherness that I anticipate to happen. So there's nothing, I quite hated more than when licensing comes for their surprise visits every couple of years. And in one year in particular, our executive director had resigned a few months prior. So we were kind of, filling in the gaps wherever we could, trying to get the flow, to keep it going. And of course, the surprise licensing visit was just kind of the thing that just